Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm Scott Winiecki, and today we're going to talk about trial design considerations in rare diseases. For this talk, we have 4 learning objectives. 1, to discuss rare diseases and orphan product approval trends. Next, to discuss challenges and considerations in rare disease drug development, because development of drugs in rare diseases is quite difficult for a number of special considerations. I'm going to talk about resources that can assist those involved in rare disease drug development. And finally, I want to talk about 2 programs, CDER's Accelerating Rare Disease Cures Program, or ARC program, and the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Program, which I'll call RDEA, which is part of CDER's Prescription Drug User Fee Act 7 commitments. If we look at novel drug approvals for CDER from 2015 to 2022, we see that half, in fact, are for non-rare indications, and exactly half are for rare indications. So there's a lot of activity and approvals going on in rare diseases. And if we look back 40 years at the passage of the Orphan Drug Act, since 1983, FDA has approved over 550 unique drugs and biologics for over 1,100 rare disease indications. However, we know that 30 million Americans live with a rare disease and that the vast majority do not have approved treatments. On this graph, if we look, the green bars are orphan novel drug approvals, that is to say for rare diseases or rare indications, and the non-orphans are in blue. And the purple line with the percentages shows the percentage of novel drug approvals which are rare. And you can see, looking from 2010 to 2022, that trend is steadily increasing. And in 4 of the last 5 years, more than 50% of drug approvals have been for orphan indications. Now I want to talk a little bit about expedited programs. These are programs that FDA has to help move drug programs through to approval more efficiently, so that after all, the goal here is to get approved drugs to the patients, right, to treat rare diseases with unmet medical needs. So there are 4 programs here. The first is Fast Track, then Breakthrough, Accelerated Approval, and Priority Review. Each of these has different qualifying criteria, and as long as you meet the qualifying criteria, you can participate in more than one of these. So I'm first going to talk about the qualifying criteria, then sort of what does that program get you? What are the benefits of being part of that program? So in Fast Track, it's for a drug that treats a serious condition, and that the non-clinical or clinical data demonstrate the potential to address an unmet medical need, which of course in rare diseases is something that we see commonly. For Breakthrough Therapy, also it's for a drug that treats a serious condition, and there's some preliminary clinical evidence that indicates the drug may demonstrate an improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over available therapies. Accelerated Approval, still for a drug that treats a serious condition, but provides a meaningful advantage over available therapies, and demonstrates an effect on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or on a clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity or mortality. And finally, Priority Review is for an application for a drug that treats a serious condition, and if approved, would provide significant improvement in safety or effectiveness. Now here are the features of the program. So with Fast Track, it's actions to expedite development and review, as well as rolling review. So it doesn't require that all of the application be submitted at the same time, but that it can be submitted in sections. For Breakthrough Therapy, there's intensive guidance on efficient drug development, as well as an organizational commitment from senior leadership, and also rolling review. For Accelerated Approval, it's approval based on the effect of a surrogate endpoint or an intermediate clinical endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict a drug's clinical benefit. And for Priority Review, it's a shorter clock for review of the marketing application, meaning the FDA has 6 months to review the application instead of the standard 10. Now I want to look at the use of these expedited programs by drug applications. So looking at the orphan in red and the non-orphan in blue. And you can see for each of these, Priority Review, Fast Track, accelerated approval, and breakthrough, that the orphan drugs are taking advantage of these at a higher percentage than the non-orphans. And I think that's good. That means that people are aware of these programs, that drug developers are taking advantage of those, and that's a good thing. And then you can see to the right of the graph, 88% of orphan novel drug approvals took advantage of at least one of these expedited programs, and 73% took advantage of more than one of these. So again, I think that's a great thing, and if you're a drug developer and qualify for one of these programs, it's definitely something that you should look into, because I think it's something that can, again, expedite the development, which is all about, again, addressing the unmet medical need for patients. Rare disease drug development is hard, and it's hard for a number of specific reasons. First, the natural history is often poorly understood. Some of these diseases affect very few people. Perhaps nobody's looked at it in depth, and we may have a poor understanding or just a very incomplete understanding of the natural history. Of course, many of these diseases are progressive, serious, and life-limiting. Most lack approved therapies, which means there's urgent need, unmet medical need, and many have pediatric onset. Inherently, in a rare disease, you're dealing with a small population, which often restricts or makes study design challenging. There's phenotypic and genotypic diversity within a disorder, so that even if a person has the same exact gene mutation as another person, those people may show up with different signs and symptoms, or they may show up with different signs and symptoms at different points in the lifespan. So often these are challenging because not every patient shows up with the same problems in the same way at the same time. Development programs often lack a solid translational background, meaning things like non-clinical data and animal models may not exist or may not be well developed. Drug development tools like outcome measures and biomarkers are often lacking because these diseases are not well understood. Sometimes we simply don't have good biomarkers that can help us better understand the disease and better understand drug effects. And there's also lack of precedent, specifically clinically meaningful endpoints. It's not always obvious what to measure that is clinically meaningful in a rare disease. It's also sometimes not easy to measure that. So those present additional challenges to drug development. There are also some considerations about the environment of rare disease drug development that can make it challenging. Often these drugs are developed by smaller companies with less regulatory experience, so that can present some challenges. On the upside, there are often active patient stakeholder groups who are looking to navigate and participate in drug development. Some of these are very experienced, others less so, but I think an active and interested patient population is definitely a plus. We also have an academic community, very dedicated, but sometimes they have limited knowledge of the regulatory requirements or aspects of clinical trial development. So I think the bottom line here is we all must engage our stakeholders to enhance the support of an understanding and to gain alignment. Because after all, we're all in the same team in terms of we want to address these unmet medical needs. We want drugs out there to treat people with rare diseases who don't have current treatments or whose current treatments may be inadequate. Now I want to move on and talk about CDER's Accelerating Rare Disease Cures program. So the ARC program's vision is speeding and increasing the development of effective and safe treatment options, addressing the unmet needs of patients with rare diseases. And the mission is to drive scientific and regulatory innovation and engagement to accelerate the availability of treatments for patients with rare diseases. What I want you to take away from this diagram is that ARC is an umbrella program. It's not an office in and of itself, but we work with many different offices across CDER, the Office of New Drugs, the Office of the Center Director, the Office of Translational Sciences. I come from the Rare Disease Program, so that solid curve shape at the bottom, I like to think of us as the connective tissue that holds all of these things together and coordinates the work between all these different offices. We often work with different offices and divisions within CDER, like the Office of Medical Policy or the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology. And we actually work across centers beyond CDER, most often with the Center for Biologics, but also with the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, the Oncology Center for Excellence, and very frequently working with the Office of the Commissioner. So rare diseases is not something that is siloed, but is something that operates across various offices within CDER, and we often work with other groups beyond CDER. Now I want to talk about some of the resources that have been developed by ARC that are for rare disease and hopefully will provide assistance and make finding information easier. One thing we're trying to do is to make the ARC page on the FDA website a one-stop shop for rare disease drug development resources. When we talked to outside stakeholders, one of the complaints that we heard was that FDA resources are often hard to find. For instance, we have a guidance document page and you can search guidances, but if you don't know the title of the guidance you're looking for, sometimes it's difficult to find the specific guidance that you need. So we're trying to make the ARC website this one-stop shop. One of the things we have on there are recordings, both the slides and the audio recordings of conferences we've held. So this can be a library or a resource. If you have a particular need about rare disease drug development, you can find the conference that fits the topic you need and go back and watch that conference. Or maybe if you attended the conference and there was a particularly interesting talk, you can go back and rewatch it. So two of these from 2022, one was jointly between FDA and NIH about regulatory fitness in rare disease clinical trials. So this is a topic that comes up very often. And this was CDER's Rare Diseases team as well as the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences from NIH. And the focus was on academic investigators and those looking how to bridge the gap between academic investigation and the regulatory aspects of drug development. Also back in May of 22, we did a workshop with Duke Margolis, Translational Science and Drug Development, Surrogate Endpoints, Biomarkers, and more. So again, it brings up that important role of translational science and the development of surrogate endpoints in rare disease drug development. This year we had two additional conferences. First, with the Johns Hopkins Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, the Johns Hopkins CIRSE. That was advancing challenges in the design and analysis of rare disease clinical trials, considerations and tools. And it talked about things like how to collect high quality and fit for purpose data and the use of real world data to inform rare disease drug development. And then we had another conference with the University of Maryland CIRSE about quantitative systems pharmacology. So a bit earlier I mentioned the guidances. So if you go to the ARC page on the FDA website, you will see this box. If you click on it, you'll see the landing page shown on the right. And what we've done is taken all of the guidances that are related to rare disease drug development that might be relevant, that we think our stakeholders would be looking for, and organize them by categories. So you can look simply under the wide-ranging category of rare disease, but also under clinical trials or real-world evidence or digital health. So we've sorted those by topic, so hopefully we've made those guidances easier to find. If maybe you don't know the specific guidance that you're looking for, this hopefully makes a resource that makes what you need easier. I want to highlight two recently issued guidance documents. One is Considerations for the Design and Conduct of Externally Controlled Trials for Drugs and Biologic Products. This came out in February of 2023. We often get questions about externally controlled trials and under what circumstances can they be used, and this guidance can be a resource there. The next guidance came out just in September of 2023, demonstrating substantial evidence of effectiveness with one adequate and well-controlled clinical investigation and confirmatory evidence. So this is often a pathway that is used in rare disease drug development, and this sort of guidance can be useful to you if that's a pathway you're pursuing for your therapeutic. We've also compiled a list of funding pages, of funding opportunities for rare disease and product development research. So again, if you go to the website, click on that box on the right, you'll get the list of funding opportunities. We also have a quarterly newsletter. You can sign up for it, and we will email you quarterly everything that's happening in rare diseases just sort of news highlights, so you can stay abreast of rare disease drug development news. Now I want to talk about one of our educational programs, Learning and Education to Advance and Empower Rare Disease Drug Developers, also called LEADER 3D. And as I mentioned earlier, we went out and sought input from stakeholders who design or conduct rare disease drug development programs to identify the knowledge gaps about the regulatory process and where we could perhaps develop or expand educational resources for stakeholders. So I already mentioned sort of that guidance list. One of the things we heard was guidances are hard to find. So we're trying to make that easier. And we're in the process of additional resources. Again, the idea being to better understand the challenges in bringing rare disease products to market, identify those knowledge gaps, and then produce educational materials on relevant topics. And when we talk to our stakeholders, both within and external to the federal government, we heard that non-clinical and clinical pharmacology was a big issue, clinical trial design and interpretation, and also regulatory considerations. I want to mention that in parallel with the LEADER 3D effort, the CDER Patient-Focused Drug Development, or PFDD group, is working with the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, to develop an advanced drug development education series that's geared toward patients and patient groups. Our materials are more geared toward rare disease drug developers, but I think patient groups often have a keen interest in these same topics. Now I want to talk about the RDEA part of the program, again, the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Program. So the idea here is it's a pilot program that seeks to advance rare disease drug development programs by providing a mechanism for sponsors to collaborate with FDA. And this would be throughout the efficacy endpoint development process. And the idea here is to, again, to increase the development of endpoints because they are often lacking for many rare diseases. So eligibility is that you should have an active IND or pre-IND, and that the proposed endpoint is a novel efficacy endpoint. This is really quite a new program. It started at the end of fiscal year 23. It's going to go through fiscal year 27, and we're going to accept up to 1 proposal per quarter or a maximum of 3 proposals per year between fiscal years 2024 and 2027. Now there is a disclosure or transparency aspect of this. We're going to host up to 3 public workshops by the end of fiscal year 27 to discuss various topics related to endpoint development. And the novel endpoints that are developed through this program may be presented by FDA in things like a guidance document, a public-facing web page, or one of those public workshops that I mentioned. We already held one of those public workshops, Novel Endpoints for Rare Disease Drug Development, in conjunction with CDER, CBER, and Duke Margolis. We held it in June. Talked about the application process and required elements for RDEA, but also scientific and technical issues that are associated with developing endpoints, and lessons learned from previous PDUFA meeting programs. This recording of this is also on the ARC website. So again, if you're interested in endpoint development, this would be a good resource. Here's the URL for the RDEA update page. So there you can get FAQs, learn about meeting packages or disclosure elements, and other endpoint development resources. Now I want to touch on another development program, the Support for Clinical Trials Advancing Rare Disease Therapeutics, or START pilot program. And the idea here is to accelerate the pace of the development of certain either CBER or CDER regulated products that are intended to treat a rare disease. This is a product focused and designed to augment the currently available formal meeting structure between FDA and sponsors. It's milestone driven, so the idea is to take a program and get it to that next big step. Maybe that's getting it to be ready to start its pivotal clinical trial or getting it to the pre-BLA or pre-NDA stage. It can address a variety of specific programmatic issues. I think it depends upon the particular product, but that could be clinical or non-clinical considerations. And for CDER, the focus here is on rare neurodegenerative conditions including those of rare genetic metabolic etiology. CBER has slightly different qualification criteria. So this is really a brand new program. Applications haven't even opened yet. That'll start on January 2nd, 2024 and go to the beginning of March. And interested sponsors are asked to submit their request as an amendment to their IND. Each center, CBER and CDER, will pick up to 3 programs to be part of this pilot program. But in the future, we might expand this program, or there could be a second iteration of the program. So now I want to talk briefly about 2 case studies, sort of illustrating the challenges of rare disease drug development and how the resources can be helpful. So first we have Velminase, and the indication here is for the treatment of non-central nervous system manifestations of alpha manocytosis, or AM, in adult and pediatric patients, and it was approved in February of 2023. So a little bit about alpha manocytosis. It's a rare autosomal recessive lysosomal disorder. It's an enzyme deficiency, and that deficiency leads to the accumulation of oligosaccharides in various tissues, and involvement includes the central nervous system, as well as the musculoskeletal and immune system. And Velminase, the drug, catabolizes these oligosaccharides that accumulate in the lysosomes. So again, just to remind you of the common challenges in drug development and why drug development in rare disease is hard. And I think that Velminase illustrates a number of these things, right? We talked about diseases being progressive, serious, and life-limiting. Well, AM is a serious disease that can lead to death in early childhood, or in later onset forms, it can lead to progressive and severe motor impairment. In terms of small populations, it have a prevalence of about 1 in 500,000. And it's highly variable in its clinical manifestations, severity, and progression. So obviously that makes conducting a clinical trial more challenging. In terms of drug development tools and outcome measures and biomarkers, the trial demonstrated a statistically significant reduction in serum oligosaccharides. However, that's not a validated surrogate endpoint, so it couldn't be the primary endpoint for the trial, but it does support the proposed mechanism of the drug. And in terms of clinically meaningful endpoints, several different ones were measured for the trial, but this included the 3-minute stair climb test, the 6-minute walk test, and the forced vital capacity % of predicted normal value. So what resources could be useful if you had a drug development program like Velminase? Well, it was approved based on 1 adequate and well-controlled trial plus confirmatory evidence. So we have the guidance list there, and we highlighted the 1 adequate and well-controlled investigation and confirmatory evidence guidance. Endpoint selection is key in clinical trials. So we have the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Program, and we have the workshop recording on our website talking about endpoint development. And perhaps if there was a need for additional meetings, the START program is something that, as a rare disease drug developer, you might want to take advantage of. Case study 2, vutrisiran, which was approved in June of 22 for the treatment of polyneuropathy of hereditary transthyretin-mediated amyloidosis in adults. So a little bit about hereditary transthyretin-mediated amyloidosis. It's an autosomal dominant disorder. It's caused by mutations in the TTR gene, which leads to protein misfolding, aggregation, and deposition in the nervous system, heart, kidneys, eyes, bone, and GI tract. So the drug's a small interfering RNA that targets the TTR mRNA, and at the indicated dose, vutrisiran reduced TTR levels by an average of 85%. So again, thinking about the challenges here, it's a serious and progressive disease, life-limiting. Death occurs within 5 to 12 years of onset, and even though there are other approved therapies at the time vutrisiran was approved, there was still significant unmet medical need because not all patients were able to receive or tolerate the currently available treatments. In terms of small populations, really quite rare, HATTR is estimated to be between 5,000 and 10,000 persons globally. And to mention the translational background, the reduction in serum TTR provided strong mechanistic support for this drug. So what about resources? Again, it was approved using that one adequate and well-controlled plus confirmatory evidence pathway. So we have that guidance. The clinical trial also used an external control. So again, to highlight the considerations for the design and conduct of externally controlled trials guidance. And then just to highlight two of the relevant workshops that we have, the recordings on the website, the FDA NIH Regulatory Fitness in Rare Disease Clinical Trials, and the Translational Science and Drug Development, Surrogate Endpoints, Biomarkers, and more. So in conclusion, I want to make a couple of points. In recent years, over 50% of CDER's novel drug approvals were for rare diseases. That CDER's ARC program will help CDER work more effectively with our rare disease drug development partners, and that CDER and ARC have multiple resources to assist with the challenges of rare disease drug development. I'd like to end with a couple of challenge questions. First, educational content on the ARC website includes A, a list of guidances organized by topic area, B, recordings of public workshops, C, listing of funding opportunities, or D, all of the above. And the answer is D, all of the above. Challenge question 2. Challenges in rare disease drug development include A, small populations, B, lack of precedent including clinically meaningful endpoints, C, phenotypic and genotypic diversity within a disorder, or D, all of the above. And the answer is D, all of the above. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back shortly for the question and answer session. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be back for this year's FDA's Clinical Investigator training course and to give you a few perspectives that I have on specific populations in clinical trials. This is my disclosure slide. In addition, I want to just point out a couple of things. The first is that my talk will focus on specific populations as defined by FDA, and specific populations is a newer term. You may have heard the older term special populations, but we use specific populations now because we think it's a more appropriate and probably more precise term. The second point I want to make today is that it's going to be a whirlwind talk, and I'm really just going to provide an overview and important guidances that FDA has published recently to provide additional, more in-depth information for you to consider. And then thirdly, that I am a pediatric nephrologist, so while my clinical expertise is limited to pediatrics and pediatric nephrology, I'm going to be talking about several specific populations today. So what do I hope to go over with you in the next 30 minutes or so? I want to review with you the inclusion of specific populations in drug development. And the three populations I really want to focus on today are children, pregnant and lactating individuals, and geriatric populations. In addition, I do want to also discuss enhancing overall diversity in clinical trials. So why am I giving you a talk on specific populations? Let me just say that on this slide, I think it demonstrates the importance that FDA has on collection of information on specific populations. Under the physician labeling rule, which is a regulation that describes, importantly, the content and format of prescription drug and biologic product labeling, there are specific sections under Section 8 that describe important information that should be included in specific populations, and you can see sections 8.1 through 8.5 listed here. I'm going to go over each of these populations during my talk today, and let me just also note that there are other specific populations that I will not be discussing, and those include specific populations that have hepatic and renal impairment. I'm going to focus today mostly on pregnancy, lactation, pediatrics, and geriatrics. So the first topic I want to review this morning is related to pediatric patients and the inclusion of pediatric patients in clinical trials. So this slide really goes over two basic tenets that are foundational to pediatric therapeutics development. First, that pediatric patients, just like any population, including adults, should have access to medicines that have been appropriately evaluated. And what flows from that is that if a product development program includes adults, but children are likely to use the drug once it's approved, that development program should also include pediatric studies. In the next few slides, I'm going to go over some basic ideas and basic principles that underlie therapeutics development in children. The first of those are the ethical and feasibility considerations. There was a guidance that was just published a couple months ago in September of 2022 on the ethical considerations of clinical investigations of medicinal products or medical products involving children. Among other really important concepts brought forth in this guideline are the three basic tenets and three basic principles that you see here. First, that children should only be enrolled in clinical trials if the scientific objectives cannot be met through enrollment of subjects who actually can provide informed consent personally, such as adults. And because children are a vulnerable population, because they cannot provide informed consent, then clinical trials involving children must offer the prospect of direct therapeutic benefit. And without that prospect of direct therapeutic benefit, the risk to the child for enrollment in a trial should be low, and low is basically defined as no more than a minor increase over minimal risk. And those notions and concepts of minimal risk and minor increase over minimal risk are really well defined and described in this guidance. And then finally, the children really should not be placed at a disadvantage by being enrolled in a clinical trial. But even when these when these ethical considerations have been incorporated, there are also feasibility issues and feasibility considerations that are commonly seen in pediatric therapeutics development that are not necessarily as commonly seen in adult product development. And this is, again, a good thing for children because the prevalence or incidence of many diseases and conditions are lower when compared to adult populations. In this next slide here, I want to go over some important concepts that are brought forward in this ICH E11R1 addendum document that I had mentioned a couple of slides ago related to the foundational principles. And in this important addendum guideline that was published by FDA in 2018, there are several areas related to pediatric therapeutics development that are found in this guidance. And it's an excellent guidance to those of you who are interested in learning more about how to conduct pediatric drug development programs. On these three bullets you see next to the guideline, I think I want to highlight these three areas. The first is the use of a strategy called pediatric extrapolation. This can be used to increase the efficiency and feasibility of pediatric product development. And the basic idea behind pediatric extrapolation is that when there are similarities between a pediatric population and a reference population, usually an adult population, that there are similarities in the course of a disease and the response to whatever drug you're studying, that those similarities can be translated into leveraging information that could lead to clinical development that requires less than the standard adequate and well-controlled trial. And this guidance does give some high-level descriptions of pediatric extrapolation. In addition, there is really clear guidance about the enrollment of children stratified or staggered by age. Typically we see, and historically we've seen adolescent studied first, then school-age children, then preschool children, then toddlers, then infants, and then newborns. And the guidance puts forth the important consideration that strategies that are relying on staggered enrollment based solely on age really should be justified, because if there's really no reason to study adolescents only first, there's no safety or efficacy reason to not enroll younger populations at the same time, that one should consider that really, because it decreases the time it takes to have the drug studied and therefore then potentially available for children to use. And then finally, the guidance goes over many other unique product development considerations, including age-appropriate formulations and safety information, including the need often for long-term safety information if the long-term safety is unknown in a pediatric population. I want to highlight on this slide one recent guidance that was published again in 2019 about actually including adolescent patients in adult trials. And here the Oncology Center of Excellence published this guidance about inclusion of adolescent patients in adult oncology trials. And really just to suffice to say that there are certain situations in which adolescent oncology patients are very similar, in fact, to adult oncology patients, including young adult oncology patients. And in those situations, adolescent enrollment should be considered to really, again, speed the availability and not delay access of potentially effective therapies to the adolescent oncology patient. And you can see in the second bullet some considerations when it would be appropriate to consider inclusion of adolescents in adult oncology trials. So taken together, I'm just giving you some highlights about considerations related to inclusion of pediatric patients in clinical trials, and just some recent guidance that FDA has published. So moving on, I want to spend a few minutes to talk about the inclusion of pregnant individuals in clinical trials. And as a background, again, no different than children, pregnant individuals should have access to medicines that have been appropriately evaluated. Now, one important distinction between pregnant individuals and children are that medicines for specific indications that are approved in adults are also approved in pregnant adults unless specifically contraindicated. In other words, a pregnant adult is still an adult, and so when the drug has been tested and approved in adults, then one does not need to say that a clinical trial needs to be conducted in pregnant adults to ensure that the efficacy is similar, unlike the situation in children. However, pregnant individuals are often automatically excluded from clinical trials. And we also know that alterations in physiology during pregnancy can affect both dosing and safety in the pregnant individual, that because pregnant individuals are often automatically excluded from clinical trials, there's often little to no human data to support the safety and dosing of the product prior to approval. And that leads to prescribers and pregnant patients really left to make benefit risk decisions without any data. And that situation is really unacceptable. And so recently, FDA has been working with external stakeholders and drug developers to consider what types of information are important to obtain to support, the appropriate dosing and safety of drugs when they're used during pregnancy. One important initiative that was undertaken by FDA over the last 7 years is the Pregnancy and Lactation Labeling Rule, or PLLR. And the reason I bring this up is not to really go into the changes that occurred in pregnancy and lactation labeling under PLLR. And you can see in this slide there was a shift in some of the location of the information. But more importantly, the PLLR was intended to improve the communication of risk information that was collected as part of the labeling of a product. But in the implementation of PLLR, FDA learned quite a bit about the state of data availability in drugs used during pregnancy. And in many cases, even though the framework and the new labeling framework was successful in improving the communication of risk when there were data that supported a specific risk, oftentimes what we learned was that data were actually absent, and that even though there was the ability to communicate in a better way, there were no data to communicate. And even when there was data available, often it lacked both quality and quantity. Finally, although there was a great desire to include definitive risk statements in labeling, often there weren't sufficient data, and that's the current state, that there are oftentimes insufficient data to really be definitive about the risks of the drugs when used during pregnancy. So as a consequence to what we learned from the implementation of PLLR, FDA published a guidance on the inclusion of pregnant patients in clinical trials. And this guidance, this draft guidance published in 2018, includes situations when pregnant individuals, pregnant women, can be included in clinical trials. It describes and follows the HHS framework for human subject protections. And it really does consider, the inclusion of pregnant individuals both in the post-market and pre-market setting. And finally, an important consideration of this guidance also is what to do when a patient becomes pregnant during a clinical trial. So all of these important considerations are described in this guidance, and I do think that it provides really a roadmap and perhaps a call to consider when pregnant individuals can be safely and ethically enrolled in clinical trials. And let me just say here too that we're not proposing that pregnant individuals just automatically be included in clinical trials, because there needs to be important safety information collected before including pregnant individuals. However, I think what this guidance put forward is the idea that automatic exclusion of pregnant individuals in clinical research is also unacceptable. And there has to be a careful review and justification for why pregnant individuals would be excluded. In addition, I think this guidance also sets up important considerations about early discussions and early planning so that the appropriate reproductive toxicity studies can be completed in non-clinical studies so that when the phase 3 trial is ready to begin enrollment, there is already some information that can help guide the safety and the safety monitoring of a drug to allow for pregnant patients to be enrolled in clinical trials. So I just want to spend a few minutes about the collection of important safety information on when drugs are used during lactation. And here again, the problem statement is similar to the problem statements I've already provided you on research in children and pregnant individuals, that medications are used in lactating individuals, often with little to no human data about the safety of the drug, in the breastfed infant. And importantly, collection of data on the transfer of drug into human milk and into the breastfed infant can provide really important information that can help prescribers and patients. Unfortunately, such data are really limited in terms of availability at this time and generally almost never do we have the information before the drug is approved. So in 2019, FDA published a guidance on clinical lactation studies. And just briefly here, I want to highlight some of the important considerations in this guidance, including describing scenarios when a lactation study would be appropriate. And also, if you're planning to conduct a lactation study, discusses ethical considerations about who can participate in lactation studies, including lactating women who are already taking the drug for medical or prescription or therapeutic purposes, and also potentially the inclusion of healthy lactating women in lactation studies as well. And those ethical considerations are described in this guidance. There are really, I think, well-described sections about different study designs that can be used and the information that can be obtained in such study designs. And then finally, sampling strategies and pharmacokinetic analysis methods are described. So this is a really, I think, complete guidance for those interested in getting more information on how to and when to conduct clinical lactation studies. So now I want to talk about the last specific population, the inclusion of geriatric patients in clinical trials. FDA has defined as part of their guidance on geriatric information in prescription product labeling as patients 65 years of age and older. And again, here, like pregnant individuals, medicines approved for indication adults are also approved in geriatric populations unless specifically contraindicated. Now, it's important to consider the inclusion of geriatric patients for many reasons, and certainly the three that I've highlighted here on this slide are major considerations. That comorbidities that occur more commonly in geriatric patients could have effects on the efficacy and safety of the product. For example, organ dysfunction can play a greater role in geriatric patients because more geriatric patients, for example, may have organ dysfunction. There is certainly a higher incidence of concomitant therapy and therefore a higher risk for drug interactions. And simply that the geriatric population is increasing in the United States, and therefore in order to appropriately study drugs and patients are going to use them, if there are more geriatric patients in the United States, then there are likely going to be more geriatric patients taking any given medication. So importantly, the labeling guidance describes when geriatric information should be placed in that section 8.5. And the labeling should provide information, if any are collected, on differences in the safety, effectiveness, or dosing, that is pharmacodynamics and or pharmacokinetics, in a geriatric population compared to a non-geriatric adult population. Here again, the Oncology Center of Excellence leads the way and has recently published a guidance in March of this year on the inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. Again, outlining why it's important to study geriatric patients in oncology trials. And you can see the at least three reasons here. The guidance also goes over ways to incorporate geriatric patients in trial designs, and also provides approaches to improve recruitment and retention of geriatric patients, and also gives additional information on important and specific adverse event monitoring and management in geriatric patients, and the potential need for collection of additional post-marketing data when geriatric patients are enrolled in clinical trials. But here, really all intended to improve the generalizability of cancer treatments, to include all the populations who might benefit from its use, including the geriatric population. I want to spend the last few minutes talking about another important topic that's not specifically related to specific patient populations, but really overall diversity and enhancing diversity in clinical trials. I think our FDA Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, said it best when he said, quote, "The U.S. population has become increasingly diverse, and ensuring meaningful representation of racial and ethnic minorities in clinical trials for regulated medical products is fundamental to public health." I think FDA is committed to ensuring the health of the entire U.S. population, and many patients in this country continue to be underrepresented, both in drug development and in access to medicines. FDA is currently working in many areas to address this underrepresentation. For example, FDA just recently convened a public meeting on November 29th and 30th on discussing approaches to enhance clinical study diversity. This meeting was convened in collaboration with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITC, and the goal of the meeting was to solicit input on, first, increasing enrollment in clinical trials of historically underrepresented populations, and secondly, how we can encourage clinical study participation that actually reflects the prevalence of the disease among demographic subgroups. There should be recordings available as well as additional publications as a result of this public meeting. So FDA has put out 2 recent guidances that describe enhancing diversity in clinical trial populations. Their first guidance, published in 2020, includes strategies to broaden eligibility criteria and also provides guidance on inclusive trial practices. And you can see here many topics discussed in the guidance that go over ways to enhance diversity, from clinical trial design and methodologic approaches to enrichment strategies, and then importantly, decreasing burden and enhancing retention. Both are important, not only to get patients enrolled, but also to keep them in the trial once they are enrolled. And there is finally a section on rare disease considerations. So again, a really important guidance that describes how clinical trials can be potentially more diverse and inclusive of populations who are likely going to be taking the drug. This slide goes over, I think, an important development in improving diversity as part of drug development, drug and device development, and it is a joint guidance sponsored by no less than 5 centers within FDA, and it discusses the inclusion of formal diversity plans as part of drug development. And you can see here that in the opening of an IND or IDE, that a diversity plan is recommended when studies that are being conducted under the IND or IDE are intended to support a marketing application or device marketing application. Diversity plans should be submitted early so that they can be discussed with the agency and advice given no later generally than end of phase 2, and also provides detailed description of what should be included in the diversity plan. I'm not going to go over each of the items here. It's really beyond the time that I have, but I have listed them here so that you can get a flavor for what types of information should be included in a diversity plan. I really think that the inclusion and the recommendation to include diversity plans in all IND or IDs that are intended to move to a marketing application will really move forward the inclusion of appropriate and diverse populations in drug development. So finally, I want to briefly mention the role of decentralized clinical trials in enhancing diversity in product development. A decentralized clinical trial is really just a clinical trial where some or all of the trial-related activities can occur at locations separate from the central or principal investigator's location. You can see here several potential benefits that can enhance diversity, including avoiding having to travel long distances or take off work or expend additional cost to participate in a clinical trial, those certainly you can imagine, would enhance diversity, particularly in populations where it is difficult to participate because of socioeconomic reasons. In addition, it can also help for conditions that are rare or where the diseases are sporadic, so that those assessments can be made very close to the time and the place where some of the symptoms are occurring. Now, of course, importantly, there are challenges related to decentralized clinical trials, including the need for more staff, because you're just going to have collection of data at more and disparate sites, and that can lead to compliance issues as well. So there needs to be really good documentation, really good training to make sure that every site in a decentralized clinical trial is collecting information in the same way, and that the data that can be used are valid and reliable. Nevertheless, again, I can't overemphasize, I think, the potential utility of a decentralized clinical trial in enhancing diversity. So I hope to have provided you a high-level summary of the inclusion of specific populations in clinical trials for drug development. And on this summary slide, I have 4 takeaways that I think are important for you to remember. The first is that pregnant and lactating and children and geriatric populations all should have access to medicines with information to support their safe and effective use. Secondly, that drug development should be designed to include specific populations when use is expected in these populations. And certainly there are unique ethical considerations in both clinical trials for children as well as pregnant individuals. Early planning is the key to making sure these specific populations are included appropriately. And remember that the U.S. population is really becoming increasingly diverse. And it's really important that we all consider how to be inclusive in clinical trials so that the clinical trials and the data that are obtained from those clinical trials can be generalized to reflect the population that is most likely to use the drug. And finally, the challenge question. Specific populations that should be considered for enrollment in clinical trials during drug development include A, pediatric populations, B, pregnant and lactating populations, C, geriatric populations, D, all of the above, or E, A, and B only. And hopefully you've all gotten the correct answer, which is D, all of the above. I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the question and answer period at the end of this session.
Well, thank you very much, Scott and Lynn, for excellent presentations. So just to remind ourselves where we are, in the morning we spent some time discussing the overall design of clinical trials in general and some of the new initiatives that are underway to increase the reach of clinical trials, including technology and real-world evidence. And now during this session, we pivoted to looking at particularly challenging areas of drug development, specifically rare diseases and diseases that affect specific populations. So I think let's turn to the questions now. And I'm going to start with a question for Lynn here. Lynn, what do you think are the most important barriers to identifying specific populations who can be enrolled in clinical trials?
Thank you, Leonard. Really excellent question. And I think the most important thing to consider in identifying barriers, pediatric, pregnant, geriatric populations, is to really understand the population who has the disease, and then to very early in development, come up with a plan that addresses that. And I think that, we say all the time in our shop that there's no replacement for early planning. And so I think a lot of the troubles and a lot of the barriers can be overcome by having early conversations with FDA and really working on a plan that includes all these patients early in development. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And a question for Scott here. I think this is something that probably would be good to kind of expand on. The question is, how is CDER's ARC program different from a rare orphan disease designation? And the questioner goes on to ask, does CDER's ARC program affect accelerated approvals in rare orphan diseases? So maybe you can tackle or disentangle the concepts for us, Scott.
Thank you, Leonard. So the ARC program, completely different from the Orphan Disease Designation Program. That's something that's done by the Office of Orphan Product Development and the Office of Commissioner. The ARC program is a CDER program, and we're not an expedited program, nor are we directly involved in regulatory review. The program's role is to drive the development and the use of regulatory and scientific tools to support rare disease drug development and regulatory science. So very different than the Orphan Disease Designation Program, and not involved in regulatory review, so does not directly impact accelerated approval. Thank you for the question.
Thanks very much, Scott. I'm going to pivot back to Lynne. Lynne, here's a question, which is certainly something I often ask myself. Can a phase 2 study with pregnant women be conducted ethically? I think the person who's asking the question is obviously aware of the risks to the fetus, to the pregnant woman, and the sort of background safety data that may be available. So I guess, what's your view on conducting phase 2 studies in pregnant women?
Wow, Leonard, that's a complicated question, but a really good one. Let me just say that unlike the pediatric population that I described as a vulnerable population, because again, children are young, such that they cannot provide their own independent consent. They can provide assent, but we really need to make sure that when we enroll children in clinical trials, that we get parental permission, that those informed consent documents are signed by guardians, and that children, if available, can provide their own assent. However, in the setting of pregnant individuals, they are not a vulnerable population, okay? They can make their own decisions, and they are able to provide their own informed consent. So the reason that pregnant individuals could potentially be enrolled in phase 2 PK studies is that if we have the appropriate safety information in place, and that is usually in the form of the important reprotox studies, the pre and postnatal development studies that should be conducted. Oftentimes those aren't conducted very early in development, and that really precludes enrollment of pregnant individuals in phase 2 or phase 3 trials. So the answer is that it's not so much an ethical issue as it is a safety issue, because pregnant individuals can provide informed consent, they can make decisions, and we just need to make sure that the safety information is available to decide whether or not the timing is appropriate to enroll those pregnant individuals either in phase 2 or phase 3. I hope that helps to answer the question. Thank you for that.
I think that certainly gives us a good view of this, a good strategy. I turn back to Scott. I have a question here from somebody who mentions, I've noted that sickle cell disease has been characterized as a rare disease, although it has a high prevalence in ex-US, outside the US. They mentioned sub-Saharan Africa. Is it the US prevalence that determines rare disease status by FDA? Or the other things that determine whether it's regarded as a rare disease? Scott, do you want to tackle that? It's a technical question.
Sure, I'll tackle that. Thank you, Leonard. So rare disease, the legal definition in the United States is fewer than 200,000 persons with the disease in the United States. So it doesn't look at the frequency or the prevalence of the disease ex-US, only the US population, and the number is less than 200,000. So good question, and it points out that it is a very specific definition, and the worldwide prevalence doesn't play into it. Thanks for the question.
Great, thanks. I'm going to swing back to Lynne. There's a question here about one of our attendants who will be working on a pediatric trial during the next year, and this individual mentions that there's already an FDA-approved drug on the market for the disease in question. What do you suggest to get parent buy-in for their children to participate in a clinical trial when there's already something available? They anticipate challenging enrollment. Any thoughts about helping them to enroll patients?
Yeah, and thank you, Leonard. Another really insightful question, and one that we have faced often in therapeutics development. I didn't provide this statistic in my talk, but on average, it takes somewhere for between 7 and 9 years after adult approval for the pediatric approval of that same drug. That's 7 to 9 years of off-label use. And during that period, and when there is off-label use, practitioners, patients, they have decided on their own and at their own risk that a drug works or doesn't work for them. So it's particularly important that we get trials started in children, as follow-on for adult drug development as quickly as possible, and to finish those studies as soon as possible to avoid and minimize that period of off-label use. So the question is, how do we do that? Particularly when there's other options available. And I would argue in many cases, the option of the unapproved drug that was already approved for adults is also already available because it's being marketed. And so I would say that, it requires a lot of effort on, in the ecosystem, I would say, to educate and to reassure and to change culture. And some of that has to do, I think, John Concato talked about it a bit. Leonard, you did too in the talks this morning about how to get the trials to the patients. And in addition to doing that, it's how do you get the buy-in and the trust in the community in whom you're going to do the trials. And that requires, I think, more than just, well, we got a drug, let's set it up and run the trial and then break down the trial infrastructure and then set it up again. So there needs to be a commitment to developing trust within the communities where the drug is going to be studied. That's not easy. I'm not suggesting that it is easy, but developing those relationships and use of pediatric clinical trial networks can definitely help to do that. I think also in figuring out how to get the trust or how to get the buy-in of the parents, it's also, we have lots now. I can describe 2 pediatric patient networks. One is the International Children's Advisory Network, or ICANN, in the United States. And then there's another organization in Europe called EYPAGNet, which is a European, I'm going to forget it, the exact acronym. But basically, these are organizations led by children who help other children understand the importance of understanding their disease and even potentially enrolling in clinical trials. So I think getting buy-in of parents involves getting buy-in in the community as well as getting buy-in from the children themselves. So maybe a sort of roundabout answer, but I hope that helps the questioner. Thanks.
I think those were actually very good answers. And while you were speaking, it occurred to me that this is pretty much a problem that applies to Scott's area as well, which is rare diseases, where I'm at least aware of certain situations where patients with rare diseases are using off-label treatments, and obviously one wants to get in with a trial before that becomes the norm. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Scott, before I go into the next question.
Thank you, Leonard. Not particularly. I think just that it is always challenging in the rare disease space because we're dealing with many fewer patients. So it's not as easy, and I think it just emphasizes the point that probably everybody speaking today has made, and that is that the design of a clinical trial is crucial and needs to be tailored toward the situation, the disease, the patient population that it's focused on. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. So while I have you on the line here, a couple more questions which are more of administrative nature. One is, can the priority review designation be granted by FDA before or after NDA submission? Any thoughts on that?
Certainly, Leonard. So priority review, and that's the expedited program that shortens the review clock from the typical 10 months to 6 months. You can apply for that with submission of the NDA or BLA, and the FDA responds to that request within 60 days. Thanks for the question.
And just to follow up on that, there's another question that's somewhat related. What is the timeline relationship between accelerated approval and priority review? I think maybe it's worth just outlining what the differences are between those programs. Any thoughts there?
Certainly. So accelerated approval is related to the use of a surrogate endpoint. And in terms of timeline, this should be discussed with the review division early, because I think the use of a surrogate endpoint is often an important issue in the review. So earlier there is better. And then I would say for priority, again, as I just stated a moment ago, that's with the submission of the NDA or BLA and shortens the review clock rather than, again, accelerated approval focused on what to use as an endpoint. Priority review shortens the review clock from 10 months to 6 months. I should also say that in terms of some of these details, because I know I went through the 4 expedited programs rather quickly, and they each have somewhat similar but different qualifying criteria. Likewise, they have different benefits. There's a guidance on this. And just to bring it back around to my talk, we have that guidance page. So if you go to the ARC website, just search FDA ARC, you should get our webpage. If you go down to that little guidance block, you can look on expedited programs. So the title of the guidance is Expedited Programs for Serious Conditions, Drugs and Biologics. And that guidance has all of the information I think that you would want to know about each of those 4 expedited programs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott. That's very clear. I think we've got time for one more question for Lynne. Lynne, what do you think about this one? For children pregnant and lactating, what do you think of trial-specific phase recommendations? And they talk about first in human. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a good one, Leonard, an interesting one. Hopefully I can answer within the time remaining. I think what I would say generally is that we have seen absolutely, and Scott can describe this too, in the rare disease setting, that yes, in fact, you can go first in human, even in children, particularly if there's really no correlate of disease in adults. In fact, you might want to wait until the adult program is completed and there's actually post-marketing safety data in adults before you even enroll a single trial, a single patient in a pediatric trial. And so what that speaks to is that the decision to move forward in a pediatric trial is very context specific, and that there is no absolute prohibition to first in human or waiting until the post-approval and long-term safety is already collected. And it really depends on all of the factors that I think we've heard throughout the day already, both in regular drug development, as you heard Fred give the talks this morning, all the way through Scott's discussion on rare diseases. So I would say that there is no absolute prohibition to first in human, just as there is no reason necessarily to wait until after phase 3 is completed, the drug is approved in adults. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for a very thoughtful answer to a challenging question. I think that brings us to the end of our time. I wanted to thank both Scott and Lynne for a fantastic session on some very important areas of challenging areas of drug development. I also wanted to thank the audience for great questions. And at this point, we'll adjourn for a 15-minute break. Thank you.